So thank you, Marty, Johan, Lundy, and Prudence. It's really good to meet you, and thanks for the invitation. And yeah, good evening, everybody. I had to practice saying good evening because I never speak in the evening. So it's lovely to meet you all. And yes, I'll be talking about entomophagy, which is edible insect eating, and how does this relate to food security and particularly to food security in Africa. Now, how did we get from thinking that insects should be less than 2% or whatever the health regulations are in our food to thinking of insects as actual food? It's quite an interesting conundrum. And I think partly it's based on our fears and our needs and our wants. We all, as creatures, need to eat. We need air, we need water, and we need shelter. And our ancestors weren't actually the ones who were inspired to go poking around in bushes where there were rustles and interesting things going on. We kind of have this built-in negativity bias, because if we were poking around wondering what was going on, we'd probably be noshed by a saber-toothed tiger or something. So we have a fear in our limbic systems, and so we've been needing to make our environment safe for centuries. And unfortunately, with our clever brains and our clever hands, we are able to modify our environment into the Anthropocene. And so unfortunately, we've sort of been driven from having the safe, biodiverse environment with all its ecosystem services through our need to be safe and secure and modify our environment to actually the opposite. And now we're sitting with an environment which is quite damaged, and we need to do something about our actions in order to modify this. So we've been blaming a lot of people, organizations, our ancestors for a very long time, and actually we need to now put that energy into trying to create solutions. So we also can't be fearful about the future. That also shuts down our thinking mode and our prefrontal cortex. We need to start thinking about what we can do to make ourselves more food secure into the future. And fear is not going to help us do that. We need to work together, and we need to be creative and interested. And how are we going to do this? Are we going to be continuing in the same mode as before, making more food, making more monocrops, changing our environment for the worst? Or are we going to try and think about something different? And one of the ways is maybe to think about how we used to live many, many aeons ago, and perhaps marry this to our scientific new knowledge and see if we can come up with something a little more helpful than what we've been doing in the past. And one of the things that people have been looking at are the edible insects. So they're not a novel food. It's often touted as this novel food source that's going to save humanity. And of course, it's not. It's only one of the tools that we might have in our armory towards food security. But there are 2,300 edible insects on the list, and this list is growing as we find out more of what people have been eating over the many years. And we have been eating insects for about 7,000 years, a long, long, long time. So it's definitely not a novel food. But they are very, very nutrient dense. They have 40 to 75% crude protein, depending on what the species is that you're eating, whereas beef only has about 40%. And that's always seen as a protein-rich food. So really, insects are the way to go if you want protein. And then what's also important to note is that not all proteins might be biodigestible, but on the insects that they've tested, and they have only tested a fraction, usually there's about 70 to 75% of the amino acids that are actually available to our bodies in a digestible form. Then the fatty acids are favorable. 10 to 60% of dry matter, again, depending on the insect. So, for example, a termite that has a lot of chitin is going to have a different fatty acid profile to, say, a lepidopteran, like a caterpillar, like a mopani worm or something. And then a lot of these are polyunsaturated, particularly in the holometabolous insects. So in the caterpillars, the mopani worms, those kinds of insects, their fatty acid profile is very good. They're also rich in various vitamins and minerals, depending on the species and depending on how you cook them. So if you ate a raw caterpillar, you'd get a lot of vitamin C because of all the the leaves that they've ingested. Generally, they're not great raw. So it obviously depends on how it's prepared. And then they're very energy rich, 2,000 kilojoules of energy per 100 grams dry matter. So it's a great snack to snack on, a lot more than beef. And then also generally they have a bland flavor. So this does depend on the insects, but what has been happening in Europe and America is people have been experimenting with crickets and mealworms, and they, especially if you rear them in on bland food, they have a really bland flavor. So lots of our staple foods, maize, wheat, have a similar sort of nondescript flavor, which means that you can add whatever flavors you would like to add to them in order to make them taste good. And then, so at the present moment, it's pretty much crickets and mealworms that are reared commercially, some grasshoppers, but most other insects are wild harvested. So that needs to be looked into for the future. So they also, just going back up in terms of the environment, the food conversion ratio is very favorable. They need much less space in order to rear them than conventional livestock like poultry and beef, etc. They use much less water. They need less energy, less sunlight, all of these things that are pretty good for an environment that's overpopulated by people and at a premium. So there are some issues around pesticide use, which one has to look at, but they can also feed into integrated pest management systems. So in the last, I think it was last year sometime, there were these swarms of locusts coming through the country, and a group of us got together going, this is a massive source of protein. We know how to catch them. The people in Uganda have been catching swarms of locusts for many, many hundreds of years. So there's techniques out there. But what's changed is that now we have pesticide problems. So we were trying to figure out how do you utilize this protein that's on the wing and destroying crops, but try to get by and past the pesticide problem. So that's actually a huge subject, a huge topic of research. How does one do this? It's a potential. And then when I was working in the Bloberg 10 to 15 years ago, farmers who were farming with those sweet potatoes, it's an Epomoya species. There's a caterpillar, the S-head caterpillar, they call it Makotopodi. It's an Agres convolvulus that used to be a pest on their sweet potatoes. So in those days, the farmers used to let the residents of the villages in the surrounding community know, and they would come in and harvest these Makotopodi. And so there was a wonderful food source and a two-way system of benefit to the people collecting them and also the farmers who didn't have to use pesticides on their sweet potatoes. So there's a wonderful process that can be examined, and more work needs to be looked at in terms of integrating pest management with food security. So there are problems, of course. There's always challenges to eating insects. Some people are allergic to them. So for example, the same thing happens with shellfish and with fish. There are people that are allergic to insects, and that needs to be, so they need to have a warning on any kind of product sold. And then there's something called seasonal ataxia syndrome, which is usually with the processionary worms. It affects your neurosystem. And then also some crickets, there are crickets that have been found with thuline in them. And so there is concern around heavy metal accumulation in some of the insects and where they're found and whether this could be a problem. So that needs some more research. Then at the moment, the nutritional value of edible insects is probably the most researched topic around insects and how to eat them. But still, there's 2,300 insects, and we've only scratched the surface on looking at their actual nutritional value. So that needs a lot more research. There's very little information around the life histories of most edible insects, particularly those of the caterpillars. They're incredibly difficult to look at the research around their ecology and their life histories. They're often specialist insects. Keeping them in the lab is troublesome. So there's a lot of research that needs to happen around their life histories. And then the other concern is at present, insects are often used as a free resource. They're seen as a delicacy. It's not like they're seen as a a food that you only eat in famine times, but they are often free in places that are in marginal communities. And if you then go and price it out of people's range, so example, selling insects from an area for them to be ground up in powder and then sold back to their same people as insect bars or something at a higher price, that's also a bit of a concern, similar to the whole biodiesel issue. So the World Health Organization have been promoting edible insects because people are not going to eat something that they don't see as interesting or tasty or nutritious. So there's a lot of promotion going around, particularly in Europe and in the States, around why we should be eating insects and why they're tasty and the fact that they are very tasty. And there's a lot of work done around trying to convert what they look like. I mean, 6 legs and wings aren't terribly conducive to eating. So trying to make them look more conventional. And much of the information is, or much of the research is around creating insect powders that can be used as a supplement to boost the protein in sort of staple foods like maize and like wheat, and then also just to be used to create products that are very conventional or tasty, like cakes and biscuits. And I mean, even in South Africa, we've been doing it. There's a company that was producing insect ice cream. Unfortunately, I didn't get to taste it. It's in Cape Town and I live in Limpopo. It was a bit far, but there's a lot of work done. And I think that high-end restaurants have a role to play in this, as do chefs, as do just entrepreneurs. How do we make this more available and interesting to people? So then there are currently quite a few projects and programs around insects in Limpopo and in the rest of Southern Africa. The one project that's happening is a DNA barcoding project. So the University of Stellenbosch are quite interested in looking at the genetics of edible insects. And this feeds into the biobase or the BOLD system, where we're trying to get genetic profiles for all our biodiversity. So it's a massive program. And Dr. Barbara van Asch has been already did some DNA barcoding work, but then she heard about edible insects, and she's been great at looking at the profiles of grasshoppers and termites, which are notoriously difficult in terms of conventional taxonomy. And if you're going to promote a food source, you're going to have to know what exactly the species is that you're eating. And some of the termites, it's very, very tricky to identify them to species level, and then that obviously is a problem when you're trying to do food labeling. So it's quite important work that she's currently taking on. And then obviously, I said before, nutritional value studies are very important and are happening. The ecological information around edible insects is very, very slim. And so I did a quick check this week just to find out if anybody's done any more in this arena. And it's still just as slim as it always was, which is worrying to me, because I have noticed that once an entrepreneur or a developer or somebody who's wanting to get something commercially available, once they get an idea, they work so much faster than scientists. Scientists, we're kind of really careful about doing things properly and slowly, and developers are just like, yes, we got to do this. It's exciting, it's interesting, we've got the info. But if they're developing something and you haven't got the ecological information around what that's going to do to the environment and the ecosystem, it's a potential danger. So those studies are very, very important, and we are trying to address that. So one of the studies, the early studies in the Limpopo, was to look at the suite of edible insects that are around the Blouberg area. The Blouberg is so far north of Limpopo Province. It's a beautiful flat-top mountain. It looks a little bit like a table mountain, but in the north, with no sea around it. It's basically a sea or a plain of savanna at the bottom, really, really hot at the bottom, and very much montane at the top. So a great suite of different habitats from the plains at the bottom to the top of the mountain. So it was a wonderful place to work in terms of looking at biodiversity of these edible insects. And when I started, a list hadn't been developed of what insects there were that people could eat. So we found wonderful information, and what intrigued me was that the people utilizing these insects had much more of an understanding of the life history of the insects than even the scientists. So for example, the hairy caterpillar on the bottom left of the screen, or peta, is what it's known as in Sepedi. We found out it was called Hemigena variegata, but I had to let the caterpillars eat and let them eclose into moths before we could identify it. And we didn't have the DNA barcoding going at that point. So we had to just wait for the moths to eclose. And then we realized that it's very little known to science. We had a name for it. We knew that it's a pictorial armata. And at that point, the science said, well, that it was specific to that tree. And that was pretty much all. So it was a wonderful caterpillar to work on and understand a little bit about the biology, how many instars it had, when it laid its eggs, did it over winter as a pupa or as an egg phase. And then, but the information that was most interesting was that came from the community. So they had known for many years that this caterpillar doesn't just eat one plant, it also eats Pyrostria hystrix, which is a funny little almost thorny thing that grows quite sparsely. So it's not very well known because the caterpillars don't aggregate on this plant because it doesn't form these big dense stands like the pictorial armata does. So it was also interesting to look at what's happening lately when people are expanding, populations are expanding, and they need fuel wood and firewood. And past, those trees were not cut down because people knew that the caterpillars used them, and there was a bit of a taboo around damaging those trees. But now people are desperate for firewood, so this is changing, and diet is changing as well as other shops move in. So people are not utilizing the insects as much as they did in the past. But it was just wonderful to see the suite of insects that we could add to the database on edible insects in the area. So it was, we did a little bit of a social sciences study as well to look and see how many people ate them. It was a huge proportion, 97% of people eat insects. Many of them believe that they're healthy. Over half the people believe that they are a healthy food. And that they're tasty. People are not eating these insects just because they had nothing else to eat. They were choosing to eat them because they were actually jolly good. And I think they're better than Mopani worms by far. Much rather eat those than Mopani worms. And then, yes, it was a concern to local communities that the insects were declining, and they felt that they were declining. Many of them thought this was due to lack of rain. But at the same time, they would be very interested in using them as a source of income. So about 4 cups per household were used while the insects were in season. And that was a long time ago. So it was over a decade ago. And they would make about 730 Rand per household per annum. So this has probably gone up. It's a project that needs to be redone and looked at now that things have changed so much in the area. And at least a third of the people engaged in the edible insect trade in the Joburg area. So Orthoptera were the most utilized, most of the grasshoppers. They're wonderful. I really enjoy grasshoppers. I think they're my favorite insect. Lepidoptera were the second most utilized, and then bees and ants, beetles. I still haven't managed to taste a beetle. They have these big weevils there, and also a jewel beetle that look very hard, got a very hard casing. Wings are hard. You wonder kind of what these things will taste like, but apparently they're very, very good. They're just hard to catch and were quite scarce. So I've not managed to sample those. And then termites. Termites are always good. They were available. The PhD people don't really eat the soldier termites much, but they do collect them because people from Venda eat them. So most of the people in Limpopo will eat the arlates, the reproductive side of the termites, rather than the soldiers. But there's another story coming about the soldier termites. And so these were, I can't see, these were the favorite insects. And so bees, Norse at the bottom, were least favorites, but these jewel beetles, the Libizzi, the Stenocera, were the most favored insects on the mountain there. So then looking at the DNA barcoding and the termitity, and also my COVID project, these photos were taken in the Bolubedu South area where we were looking at barcoding of termites. It's quite an interesting project because in the Bolubedu South, people eat the soldiers termites and they also sell them to vendor people. And what's lovely about soldier termites is they're available for a much longer period than the arlates, the flying termites, and they can be induced to come out of their mounds if you throw water on them in the winter. So it's a kind of insect that's also available during the winter, which is pretty unusual. And so DNA barcoding was quite important because we could not figure out which species these were. So the barcoding gave us an interesting insight into what the species were. And because they're so confined to their mounds, once you know what species are in that termite mound, and you can harvest it ongoing. You know that you will be collecting this species and you can use it for products, and know that you're not collecting some random new different species that's not been labeled and isn't on your food product. So if you're collecting the flying termites, you won't know what is coming to your light. And also the reproductive phase are very, very difficult to identify sort of conventionally with their morphology. The taxonomists always use the term the soldiers anyway for identification purposes. And then during, can't always see my notes, during COVID, I heard that there was this caterpillar that was found in the middle of winter and harvested in winter on the Dombeira rotundifolia trees in some of the mountains near the Bultberg and in Mpumalanga. So we raced out, trying to get to Mpumalanga and back before the curfew to collect these caterpillars and then get them onto the DNA barcode list, because we didn't really know what they were. So once we finally found them, we realized that they are Anafe, but we don't know which species. So they're a processionary caterpillar. They're the caterpillars that form these lines, nose to tail lines, for a protection strategy, so that if birds see them, they presumably think they're snakes instead of tasty caterpillars. And then they also congregate in the evenings when they're resting, and they also spin communal cocoons. So, and the other thing is that all the other edible caterpillars that I've come across so far bury themselves in the sand to pupate, whereas these ones spin cocoons. So we managed to get them. They're sitting, waiting to be DNA barcoded, waiting for their genetics to be done. So we at this point don't know which species it is. And I finally this winter managed to collect 8. I only got 8. And they did a little procession around the bucket, and then, because they need to do that in order to pupate, and then they made these little cocoons. So I'm now waiting for them to emerge, and we'll see whether the genetics gets done and we figure out what species it is through the genetic route, or whether these things actually close and I get some moths and we can identify them more conventionally. But they are heavily parasitized by wasps. So I don't know. I don't know if they've been parasitized, if they'll ever hatch. We'll see. So this is the other DNA barcoding project, which is on the grasshoppers. We'd like to know what exactly we're dealing with, because the grasshoppers are also notoriously difficult to identify, and we had to really search around to get a taxonomist to help us with them. And we like to link the vernacular name with the species name, so that people in the villages can then learn the species name, and we can get a list of the vernacular names and which language it comes from. So they took our really scrunched up, terrible bodies of grasshoppers and did some beautiful photography with them, which helped the taxonomist to figure out what they could be. And we did the same with the termites. So there's a lot of cryptic diversity, and they found that there were definitely more species that were identified from their genetics than were identified through conventional taxonomy. And now it's just an example of a label that has been developed for some of the products that are coming out of the soldier termites from an entrepreneur in the Borobelo South area. So it's very important that he gets the actual species name of this termite that he's utilizing. So this story is an interesting story, because it combines science with indigenous knowledge, with entrepreneurship, and with a French intern who came over and with her French flair assisted us in developing some kind of products from these soldier termites that Martin powdered and got into a flour. So Marie Colombia was interested in edible insects, and she came to do an internship with us in Limpopo and met Martin. And Martin is a young guy who was just out of school at that point, and he has a termite heap in his backyard, and he has many friends and many elders that he knows who collect termites and sell them on the market in Borobelo South. And so together they developed this flour and experimented with some various products and made protein bars and made some granola. And then through our food technology section at the Limpopo University, these bars were checked for their nutritional value. And the long and the short of it is, it's a really long story to go, involving many years, but Martin took the idea to CEDA, and they gave him some initial seeding funding to produce some more of these for the commercial market. but they needed to be double test checked by the SAB Bureau of Standards in South Africa, and he got some funding to do that. And at the moment, what he's doing is he's used his seed funding to develop a kitchen, and that's up to sanitary standards. And so although he's baking other products and doing other things as well, it was actually the edible insect bars that got him the funding, that get him the interest, and that have allowed him to sell his products. And he's been to the BioTrade Festival, and people are getting interested in the products that he's selling. However, they're not enough to keep him going, so he needs other. He's selling peanut bars and marula nut granola, and he's doing egg production. So although the insects are really vital, they're not the whole of his story, they're not the whole of his income. And also, at the moment, we're still not entirely sure of what the impact will be on the termite heaps. But the wonderful thing is termites are seen as a pest, and in the area where he stays, many termite heaps are actually destroyed in order to either put in pasture or because people want to put homesteads in. So he's been utilizing these same termite heaps for at least 3 years now. And so he keeps his termite heaps because for him, they're a very valuable resource. And he's also very, very interested and very, very committed to talking to the people in his community about why they shouldn't be using so much pesticides on their subsistence land where they put their cattle and where they grow other crops. Because he's saying that he's worried about the grasshoppers that they also catch in those areas. And so he's spreading the word around environmental sustainability. And it's wonderful. It's not some outside person coming into a village telling people what to do. It's the member of the community that's talking to people. So that's just some of the projects that we've got going also in the Guyana area, and what we've been utilizing in those areas, and why it's important to share information, because I got information from people in Guyana who use various grasshoppers and various termites, but we could also give them information about pesticides and the problems that could be causing for them collecting these insects, etc. So it's really a collaborative effort. We're very, very concerned that people in remote rural areas are losing this knowledge. Children don't go out into the field to herd cattle because they're at school, and rightly so, but they are not connecting with their grandparents and elders who know this information, and so they definitely know less than what their grandparents know. We did some studies in Bloberg along those lines. So information sharing is really vital. So we try to create posters, we try to create awareness, we try to put information into whatever language it is that the people speak in the areas where we've been collecting the insects. But it's always quite hard to get funding for this, and a lot of the work still ends up going into scientific publications and not often being translated back to the people from where it originated from, in a way. And so this is a big gap, as well as the environmental knowledge around what this collection of insects is going to do to the ecosystem. So lots and lots of work to do, all interesting work, all fun, and hopefully valuable, and hopefully leading to a better food security in the future. So thank you very much. This is the Limpopo River. So I just put it in because all our work has been to the south of the Limpopo River, and it would be great to extend that a little bit as well. So thank you for listening and for being here.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I would like to thank you for your talk this evening. I think that for everybody who was here, we could all, more than anything, evidently see your passion in the work that you do. And this talk has made me very nostalgic of a big part of my childhood. We grew up eating termites, would collect them after the first rains, you know. My mom actively collects mopani worms and sells them currently in Zimbabwe. And so all the things you've spoken about, for me, are very heartfelt stuff. But I think on an educational side, it's been very important for you to share the information sharing of the indigenous knowledge, of the bridging the gap between the younger people and the communities and getting it in their language. I think that's been very important. And so I think on behalf of everybody, your talk has been very insightful. It's been colorful. It's given us a different perspective to insects and to food security. Thank you. So at this point, I am going to open the floor for the question and answer. If anybody would like to ask a question, you can lift up your virtual hand. You can pop a question in the chat and I will get to you. Before I get to that, I'm going to read a few comments from people in the chat. Fiona says, this talk is already fantastic. And this was like 10 minutes into your talk. And Eric also said that this was very interesting. They never knew that insects are also another kind of food. And we have a question from Fiona. She says, could there be an issue with pathogen transfer as inverts are often vectors for disease?
Yes, another big gap in the knowledge. So apart from the heavy metals, there is a worry. I think the more concerning is how are they prepared. So it might not be the pathogen from the insect itself, but there's quite a concern around how the insects are prepared, which is why Martin needed his phytosanitary certification. But when we did some provisional testing in the Bloberg area, I was surprised to find that they did pick up some E. coli, and there was another bacteria I can't remember the name of, but it's kind of a common one that occurs where you're preparing food. They weren't at terribly unsafe levels or anything, which for me was amazing because people were preparing these caterpillars in a very rural setting. There wasn't a lot of water, being Limpopo, and there wasn't electricity. So we checked fresh caterpillars and we checked dried caterpillars, and they were all pretty safe. I'd love to redo this, but yes, the actual other pathogens, I haven't seen a lot of information, a lot of research. It's a big gap.
Okay, there's a comment from Michael. Michael says, I'm going back to eating insects that my grandmother used to prepare for us. Good stuff and interesting talk. A question from Paul Mboweni. They say, there's this worm, I'm not sure what it's called in English, but it's referred to as chichiboya. I'm not sure if I saw it in the presentation or not, but it's very hairy. Are those edible?
I'd love to know what language that is and where they were collected, because I'd love to find out myself. I've heard of chichiboya, but we didn't manage to connect the vernacular name with a species name or a specimen. So I'd love to find out more and see if we can solve the mystery, but I don't know. I've just heard of it.
So Alex just said chichiboya is Tsonga. So maybe Paul will get back to us about that.
So Guyani, I'll go to Guyani.
Yes. We have a comment from Mark Lottich. He says, thank you for an intriguing talk. Great opportunity, but as Dr. Egan said, there's no free lunch. Knowledge gaps need closing. We have a question from Tasia, so you can unmute and ask your question.
Oh, good evening. First of all, I want to myself. I don't have a question today. I have a comment. I wanted to say thank you so much for the talk. It was a expositional talk. Like myself, I'm from Guyana. You see, I wanted to get insight when they say it's Chichiboya. It's not Tonga, that one. And Maponya worms is the one who attracts that another Chichiboya. It's the one that when you touch it, it makes your skin to itch. You itch a lot when you touch it. It's black in color, and it has like black fur on all over its body. And you see Maponya worms, me and my grandmother, we always go in the trees and go and harvest Maponya worms, and we eat Maponya worms. They are very healthy for your skin. They make your skin very healthy if you can eat them like every day. Thank you so much for the talk. It's very interesting. Have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tasia.
Thank you so much, madam.
We have another question. Paul came back to us and said, it looks like a Mopani worm, but it's hairy. He's from Zanini, but he sees them there. We have a question from Michael Vickers from UFS. They say, I'm curious about insects that are chemically defended as in the late 90s. Dr. May, I don't know how to pronounce the surname, Dr. May indicated over 800,000 arthropods are chemically defended. How do we get individuals interested in eating insects when there's potential harm from their defenses? Does the cooking method affect this?
So just one example, and it's a very, very good question and a definite concern. So I think we can learn from the traditional knowledge that's out there already, which is why it's great to get this list of insects and how they're prepared and collected. So for example, podile, which is the Pedi word for Tongolifa, which is collected by the Venda people. It's a stink bug, big, big stink bug. And it obviously has a chemical defense, which is that smell, which is really awful. So what traditionally is done is they're stirred in warm water until they release the smell. There's another method as well. I can't remember what that is offhand. But if you don't prepare them correctly, then you are going to obviously suffer. Apparently, if you use the ones that haven't released their scent, they're a very good bubblist treatment for hangovers. So maybe they do have some kind of medicinal properties as well. But I think that if you're going to look at any way in promoting these insects, each species should be looked at in depth, even if it is already being eaten, for those chemical defenses. And it's a problem also with anti-nutrients. So yes, we did some of the nutritional analysis of some of the insects in the Blowberg, but we only did a really basic proximal analysis of it. We didn't say, okay, that's got like 60% of protein. We didn't then go and check how much is that actually bioavailable. And there's also anti-nutrient issues with some of the insects. So it takes a lot to get a species into the commercial market, because you've got to check all of those aspects around it.
Okay, we have a hand from Chloe. Chloe, you can unmute and ask your question.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Bronwyn, for the interesting presentation. I remember a few years back when you started with this work, I think I was still doing my third year at the University of Limpopo. So it's good to see that it has grown in leaps and bounds over the years. My question is just on the how in most cases, when people harvest and eat insects, it's still a little bit looked down on or shunned upon, because people think it's a more of a, people coming from more of the poverty side of things than really more of a protein supplement for their food. I mean, just wanted to know if you have come across, that kind of narrative, and how do you usually navigate around it just to promote the nutritional side and aspects of eating insects for protein?
Yeah, especially when I started the work, I just found it intriguing that in Europe people were promoting this, and it was sort of a high class kind of a food, because it was novel and different, and specialist restaurants would sell them. And at the same time, they were declining in acceptance in South Africa, because for precisely the reasons you were saying. People would move out of the villages into towns and cities and not want to be seen sometimes as coming from a background where you ate insects, because they're cheap. They were cheap, free food, despite the fact that they're really good, nutritional, and sometimes were seen as a delicacy. So I think that narrative is still around, but as you start talking to people, and as it does become known that restaurants in Cape Town are selling them, or that people are looking for them in Joburg, it is changing. So Martin himself has noticed like a shift in people's perspectives as there's more information around the declining environmental health, etc. Even people who are from quite remote areas have access to that information now. So for me, that is definitely shifting. It's just a case of getting the information out and sharing it.
We have a question from Rubibi Ben Johnson, who's in Rwanda. He says, I love this talk. When I was young, we used to eat termites raw as snacks. I still can't understand where that innate energy to eat them came from. However, termites and other insects like grasshoppers have been labeled as food for impoverished households. Have you encountered such cases in your endeavors? And how can we break the stereotype around insects as food?
I think Yes, I did. I have encountered that. I've also encountered the narrative of only children eat insects. You know, they're the food for when you were kids, and it was fun, and it was like just what we did. But as you grow older, then no, you don't eat them anymore because they're not a child's food. And I just think it's a case of a lot more exposure and information, and because so many more people are connected with the internet and YouTube, it's happening exponentially fast. So when I started, there was a lot of that narrative, and there was also the narrative coming from a more Western side or more modern side of, ooh, insects are really gross, and how can you do that? And I used to start my talks by trying to convince people that insects were not disgusting and horrible to eat, or to get over the yuck factor. And nowadays I don't even really dwell on it much, because people are much more curious about what it could taste like than, oh no, I don't want to try. So that aspect has changed, and it's just information and sharing on the internet and YouTube and talks. And I think the same will go for, oh, these are a children's food, or a food for just the poor. It is changing. People are becoming curious.
Yeah, cool. Another question from Eric. Eric says, great work, doctor. Will eating of these insects affect the food chain as a scientist?
So that is one of the biggest concerns that I have, because ecological studies are really long term. You need at least 3 years, and that's pushing it, to get to understand the life cycle of one of the caterpillar species. And that's just to understand its life cycle and its life history. That's not to understand what harvesting does to it, or what a rainy period compared to a drought period does. So I worked on insects for 5 years on one species, and tried to get a handle on the ecology, and it was really difficult. So I tried to see what happens with harvesting the borpeta, for instance. And I looked at an area in a nature reserve compared to an area in the villages where they were being harvested, and you could really see that there was a difference. But I don't know if that was an artificial difference. It was very hard to put controls in place. And then when the climate or the rainfall changes, the rainfall patterns change, that adds to the ephemerality of the insect, because if there's rain one year, there might not be rain in that same place the next year. And so the populations aren't always around in the same place. So we need more ecologists, and we need more people willing to work on insects. It's a great, great thing to study, because they're not like lions and cheetahs and jackals, and they're much easier to study, but it does take a lot of work and a lot of time. So no, I don't have the answers. Even just those termites, which it's a big experiment. Thankfully we don't feel as worried about them, because they're seen as a pest anyway. So I feel like at least if they're being used, and Martin knows that he's got to keep these termites going because he's using them, he's not going to pour fumigant down the termite heaps. So I feel like termites are a much easier one to experiment on, because they're seen as pests anyway. But I haven't really answered your question. A lot more work needs to be done. They definitely have an impact on the food chain. They're vital to the environment. But if they're seen as useful and we can keep them going as well, that'll be great, instead of just poisoning them with pesticides.
Cool, thank you for that. We have a hand from Annabelle Banda. So please unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. That was a great presentation, Doc. When you were going through your presentation, you said something on these insects having an effect on, is it human health or some nervous system? Would you mind to go back on that slide? I didn't get it very well.
It was, I think, the seasonal ataxia syndrome and the toluene in crickets, and there was also a worry about the allergic effect, or the effect on your allergies. I'm just trying to see if I can share this again and find it. It was the catch. Yeah, seasonal ataxia syndrome and the allergies and the presence of toluene in crickets. So seasonal ataxia syndrome has been linked with that processionary caterpillar, the very hairy one that I've been trying to rear. I'm unfortunately not very, very clued up with what it it is exactly, I think it's a nervous system disorder, and it's not apparently fatal, and it passes fairly rapidly. What I don't know is it only certain individuals that get affected by it? Is it everybody? And I don't know if you can change the effects, like if you prepare the caterpillar in a different way, whether that would change it. So I'm not terribly helpful on answering your questions, but it just did put it in there to say that you can't just assume that any edible insect is going to be perfectly fine for your health. Yeah, it's a little bit sort of a personal thing that you have to work out, like whether you're allergic to peanuts. It's something that you have to find out, but it hasn't stopped us marketing peanuts, even though they can be actually fatal to some people. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great, thank you for that, Annabelle. Marty, you have a question?
Well, thanks, Bronwyn, for a really interesting talk. I just wanted to ask, I mean, you did say that most of your studies are around wild populations, and I think the question asked earlier is, you know, for a smaller population size, utilizing, harvesting, etc., you know, things are sort of still kept in balance. But if it becomes mainstream food, potentially it can have a problem. Are there any insects that specifically lend themselves to commercial rearing, for want of a better word, in a almost factory environment? I've heard of people literally buying the blood from abattoirs and breeding flies, and that actually creates huge amounts of what are they called, baby flies, those awful little worms, what they called,
those little maggots.
Maggots, that's the word. Yep. And then those maggots become chicken food or some other food, and they actually work well into the process as opposed to other sources. Are there any sort of indigenous wild insects that could potentially lend themselves to commercial breeding, and it wouldn't actually affect the indigenous populations in any numbers in any way?
Yeah, the crickets. So there are indigenous crickets that are eaten. The gryllus, I can't remember the species name, but there are two species of crickets that are eaten traditionally that I know of. There are probably more. And crickets have been reared for forever, for the food trade, for the pet trade, for reptiles like lizards, also for amphibians like frogs. So our indigenous crickets would probably lend themselves to that. And then grasshoppers, they have been reared on a large scale. They're a little more tricky than the crickets, but you can get them to eat artificial food. And even caterpillars can be reared on artificial food. It just takes quite a lot of doing in order to get the research around that, sorted and figure out what you can feed them artificially. I have to say that I am not interested in doing that research because oh man, those caterpillars! I had my kids didn't grow up on silkworms. They grew up on bobelo, and they looked after them, and it was such a mission to keep them alive. So I don't like to promote the idea of caterpillars. Termites could be a possibility. The chitin, I saw briefly somebody was talking about chitin. We haven't done enough studies on the soldier termites to just see whether how many anti-nutrients there are in those termites, because they have a lot of chitin. They also have a lot of iron. They're probably the insect with the highest iron content, but how much is biodigestible, I don't know. So at the moment, mealworms, and mealworms are South African. There's a species that is South African, couple of species. Mealworms, crickets, and grasshoppers are probably the ones to start with. Mealworms aren't as nutritious as grasshoppers and crickets.
I mean, I just think of those kind of annual infestations of locusts where they literally swarm across the Karoo and nuke the whole place. Whether there's a opportunity to somehow harvest them and actually keep them alive in some way, so there's fresh, so there's no preservatives or any of these sorts of things. But yeah, that's just sort of the question. And then I've got this picture on my background. You may be able to see it. It was one of the I think working for water, or one of the sort of non-governmental organization that were assisting with gardening in Kruger, and we had a tree that fell down, and these massive grubs were in the roots of the tree, and I think they had literally chewed the tree to the point where it fell down. So someone was asking me a question about them. What are they called? Letitia Motsejo asked me, we saw the worm you have on your arm at church today. What is it? Do you know what this chubby worm is? I mean, it was literally bigger than somebody's thumb. So, but yeah, and the lady who put it on her arm, she said that when they were kids, they used to eat these, and it was a massive delicacy. You know, the bigger, the grubbier, the oozier, the better. So, yeah, quite an education.
So, I'm wondering if this is something that a friend or I can't even remember who it was, but somebody also described that was from Joburg. It must be a similar or same thing. It looks like a beetle grub, but where's our entomologist person? Maybe they have a better idea than just a general idea of maybe it's a beetle grub, which is what I'm thinking. But I have heard of this before, and they couldn't even give me the indigenous name, the vernacular name. Oh wow!
So this was inside the roots of it. There must have been about 8 of these big grubs, and yeah, the lady was very tempted to eat them, but because she was in the park, she released them back again.
But I would love it. Yeah, if you want to send me the photo, I'll try and find out. Cool. And there was another question that I also wanted to say, if you want to connect with me, if anyone has questions or wants to connect or has insects they're interested in, please let me know. Yeah, I think it was somebody else. But I'm sorry, I can't give you a species name.
No, that's cool. And if anyone does know, raise your hands, and then we'll let you talk. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. And just a question to answer your question on the locust swarms. Yes, if we can figure out how to know whether they've been contaminated by pesticides, they are a massive resource. And then one wouldn't even need to keep them alive. You could just freeze them. Freezing is a brilliant way of keeping insects fresh, for want of a better word. You don't necessarily have to keep them alive if you've got a big enough freezer.
No, cool. Awesome. Thanks. I think Enslin is their hand up, so maybe Prudence, you want to go. Thanks.
Prof. Enslin, you can unmute and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Bronwyn, yes, thank you very much for a great talk. Listen, this may be a bit of trivia, perhaps, but of late I've been reading up quite a lot and quite broadly about the carnivore diet. And as it is, the people who actually delve into that from a scientific point of view, a lot of them sit in the US, for instance. Now, what I've noticed, though, is that many of the people who are researching the carnivore diet have of late started including eating insects as part of the agenda. And that is something that, I personally never thought of. And I think many people initially, when the Atkins craze was on and all those kinds of things, and Atkins actually, became a thing of the past after the demise of Dr. or Professor Atkins, and now it's called the carnivore diet. But of late, as I say, it seems as though the insect thing is part and parcel of that basket of research. So it may be significant because in the United States, a lot of research is currently going on as far as carnivore diet is concerned. And of course, included in that is the possibility that insect protein can bring some or contribute to some of the benefits that people who propose the carnivore diet is actually looking for or trying to focus on. Thank you.
Yes, I looked into the Banting diet. It was also called that. It was kind of similar, low carb, very low carb diet, lots of vegetables, but definitely a sort of emphasis on the protein. And at that point, I also thought, wow, insects would fit into that because you can make flour out of it, and it makes a pretty good biscuit, and it makes a pretty good bar, and it's protein. So I agree with you. It would be suitable. It's animal protein, so I presume it would be suitable for the carnivore diet. I don't know all the nutritional facts and how it would relate in terms of, how much you should eat. But it's something that I think could fit in really well. I also think that it fits into the health food industry because it's not at the moment the GMO type food, and it's also one would have to make sure that it was environmentally sustainable. And as I said, we need the research around that. But at the present moment, it's probably better than battery chickens or feedlot cattle, etc., etc. So yeah, I agree with you. I agree that it's a really could be quite an interesting thing to do the research around.
Cool. We have a question from Mohammed. He says, a challenge with insects as food centers around chitin content that is not digestible. How do we overcome this?
Yeah, I think it's again that story of finding out what's biodigestible, what's available to our bodies, and not just looking at the insect on its own and saying it's got this percentage of protein and this percentage of chitin, and etc. Because the chitin is a challenge, and obviously it depends which species of insect you're eating as to what percentage of chitin it is and what does your body do to it. And then there's a whole other subject of insects as some kind of medicinal source or source of medicine of various types. So there's talk about how it was also the Pedi people in the Bloberg area that did use some of the insects as medicine, and one was one of the big grasshoppers they used for chest for respiratory problems. But I didn't go into that at all. I was just, okay, there's so much work to do, let me just focus on the edible side. But there's all these properties that insects have, they should also be looked at from a medical point of view. But again, you'll have to look at the biodigestibility, and also the lentils and the legumes, we eat those, and it depends on how you prepare them as to how well they're digested. So we've had challenges before with different food sources on how we prepare them in order for our bodies to be able to digest them. So we can do the same with the insects, but it needs research.
Cool. We have a comment from Dorothy. Dorothy says, great talk, especially on pointing out the existence of more ethnospecies. I can see a lot of similarities with the few findings we had in a preliminary study here at the Natural History Museum in Zimbabwe. Looking forward to looking more into the knowledge gaps you mentioned. Then we have another question from Eric. He says, how do you conduct that harvesting for those people eating the insects? Is it on a daily basis, and can that not lead to a decline of insect species in the area?
Yeah, so the Mopani worm population in South Africa is declining. We don't have good data on by how much and why. One of the reasons is habitat destruction. That's a big reason. People's homesteads are expanding. We have talk of this massive SEZ, that's special economic zone, that's going to be put right where the Mopani fields are. So I don't know what kind of an impact that's going to have. And then just generally, in the past, people would harvest the insects sustainably, and now we have talk of, well, if they can't reach the top Mopani worms, then they just chop the tree down to be able to harvest all the Mopani worms. And then I heard a story, because personally I think this is true, that the Botswana and Zimbabwe Mopani worms taste better than ours. I don't know, the ones I tasted from Botswana were much better than the ones I got from South Africa. And one of the stories was that it's because in South Africa we harvest them when they're too small. So traditionally you should wait until they're 4th or 5th instar before harvesting them. And apparently, but this is again hearsay and not being checked, is we harvest them in South Africa, we harvest them at a much smaller size. So yeah, we struggle in South Africa to enforce the environmental laws that we already have. I don't know how we would enforce harvest restrictions on certain of the edible insects. And my worry is that people who live in rural areas are often marginalized in terms of their intake of protein and good healthy food, and those are the people that should really be benefiting from these insects that occur in their areas. And they are also the custodians of the environment, the natural environment that supports these insects. So that link needs to be supported and nurtured.
Cool. We have another question from Bongisiwe. They say, informative session, thank you. Have you worked on black soldier fly? I would try to say the scientific name, but I probably struggle.
Yeah, I'd struggle myself. No, I haven't worked on it. I know a little bit about it because the ice cream that I mentioned earlier on that was produced in Cape Town, as far as I know, they kept it quite quiet, but as far as I know, that was based on black soldier fly or something very related to it. So no, I haven't worked on it. I was trying to work on the insects that were harvested in the wild, and that one was commercially, well, that was weird commercially, so I didn't work on it. I'm so sorry. Can't say a lot about it, but it has a huge potential. And what's wonderful about it is it doesn't need to, how can I say this? You don't need to give it like fresh grass or something. The food source that it uses is a waste source, so that is an incredible it forms an incredible loop in this closed food chain system. You know, you're not feeding it on something that you could have used as a human food source. You're feeding it on a waste product. So that's really useful.
Cool. We have another question from Eric. He says, by using conservation terms and also asking conservationists, insects are known to also be very important in the ecosystem and in biodiversity. Is that not illegal by doing so? And is it not against Wildlife Management Acts? Yeah.
So there's two things. Insects, when I did my study, I didn't need to get animal ethics approval either from an environmental point of view, like what is this going to do to the environment? You need to be careful about how many you use in your research, etc., which is what would definitely happen if you were, for example, studying a jackal or a mammal or something, or birds. And then the other thing that I didn't need was I didn't need animal ethics approval in terms of, well, are you going to harm this animal and how are you going to look after it and what experiments are you doing on it? Because insects were kind of regarded as kind of, well, plants, you know, just, you know, they don't have nerves, they don't have whatever. So both those things are changing, particularly since we're realizing that insects are declining. So bees, in fact, I heard from a vet at another conference that at their university, they're going to look at putting bees onto the animal ethics committee so that you have to get animal ethics approval on how you're going to work with bees and how you're going to be humane and how you're going to look after them humanely. So that is changing a bit. Where was I going with this? In terms of the conservation aspect, what I was quite interested in the study that I did in Bloberg, and I see that it seems to be repeated in other studies, not just in South Africa, but also in various other African countries, is that insects are often harvested from croplands. So when I did my check to see, I thought they would be harvested from pristine natural environments, and that's where the best insects would be and the most insects and etc. And no, most people collected the insects from the croplands and the pasture lands around their gardens and their houses and their yards. And partly that makes sense because grasshoppers are pests on crops, so it made a whole lot of sense. Maybe it was also because those were the closest places, so you didn't want to walk to the top of the mountain, you know, you'd first harvest your insects from where they were around you. But this is, conservation scientists are looking at this being part of like a regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture environment where you harvest your pest species instead of using pesticide on them, and then that won't have a conservation impact, or it won't have such a big environmental impact if you're harvesting insects from land that is already modified and utilized for other reasons, rather than going and taking them out of a pristine natural environment.
Cool. We have a comment from John and Margaret Cooper. They say the Veterinary Invertebrate Society here in the UK is interested in pathogens of food insects. See their website. Also, we should remember that Sir Arnold Onderstepoort, in brackets, did research on locust disease in South Africa in the late 19th century. Then there's another comment from Andy P. They say, awesome presentation, really interesting, thank you. Need to leave, keep up the great work and look after yourselves and each other out there. And the last comment, well, there's one more question, but there's another comment from Fiona who say, best talk I've watched so far, thank you. And then the last question, I think, is from Jonathan. They say, is there a situation where these insects can be consumed without being cooked, or it must be cooked for human consumption?
Termites are eaten raw often. I don't think they eat the soldiers raw. I think they nip you and they're quite crunchy. But the reproductives are eaten raw often. I haven't tried them. I've cooked them. And I'm trying to think, they definitely, some people eat the grasshoppers raw. I think if you were going to sell them commercially, you probably would want to cook them just to make sure that any of those pathogens we're talking about, there's less chance of those being transmitted. So I think you might want to cook them. But yes, some of them can definitely be eaten raw. I don't know about a Mopani worm. They are really, really spiky. They need a lot of preparation. So it would depend on the species.
Great. Thank you for that question, Jonathan. I don't see any other questions in the chat. There's no one's hand up. So we've come to the end of the Q&A. Thank you, Dr. Bronwyn, for answering our questions so comprehensively. And I'll hand over to Marty.
Well,
Thank you, everyone.
cool, guys. And yeah, thanks for the most enjoyable talk. And I think stretching people's comfort zones, but I think all with good reason. And it was great to see so many comments of people who have eaten insects and they're still alive. So that's a good sign. But yeah, thank you very much. Really interesting. And I'm sure you'll have more research to share with us in the future, and maybe take some of our questions that we've asked and be able to share those back with us. So thanks, everybody. And there were a couple of people asking for either the notes or the slideshow. Typically, we don't share the actual slides, but all the recordings of the entire talk are available on the LCA YouTube site. So please go have a look in the chat for that link, and please go have a look. There's some amazing talks, and you'll keep yourself busy if you've got nothing to do for at least a year, I'm sure. But yeah, thanks very much. It's been a great evening, and thanks again, Bronwyn.
Thank you so much. Thanks.